Yo, what is going on, America's History people? We have chapter 29 of the 8th edition. Only 2 more chapters after this. Chances are it's getting close to that exam in May, and best of luck to you. You definitely will see some stuff from this chapter on that exam. Before we begin, it's shout out time. All 3 are going to the state of Texas. We have Mrs. Irish's class, Monsignor Kelly Catholic High School, and Mrs. Griffin's class, all from Texas. Thank you guys so much. I cannot believe how many people watch my videos in Texas, especially Monsignor Kelly Catholic High School. Seems like everybody there watches them. So thank you all for your support. I appreciate it. And best of luck to you on your exam in May. You guys are going to rock it. All right, let's get started with an era of limits. So something to keep in mind as we go throughout this chapter is that the economy of the 1970s was plagued by a term called stagflation. Please know this, very important. That is an economy that has high interest rates, which discourages loans and can discourage business growth, high unemployment, and also slow economic growth. This is a politician's worst nightmare economically. It is bad, very bad for the economy. All right, so we have an energy crisis, and we have OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. This is an example of a cartel or a group of countries that get together and try to control oil prices and supply. And you notice here that many of these countries are from the Middle East, at least the original members. And in 1973, we have the Yom Kippur War, in which the United States supported Israel against Egypt and Syria, who was fighting in this war. And this led to an oil embargo from OPEC. They were upset with the U.S. supporting Israel, so they instituted an embargo on the United States, and we see gas prices soaring and long lines at gas stations. Many times you would see cars waiting for hours in order to get gas. The national speed limit was reduced to 55 miles an hour to conserve gas, and we also see the higher sales of smaller foreign cars as well as a way to save on gas. All right, environmentalism. This focused on the preservation and conservation of the environment. It was sparked in large part by this woman, Rachel Carson, who wrote Silent Spring. This could be a great excerpt for a multiple choice question, an excerpt from Silent Spring. So she writes this book, and she exposed the dangers of pesticides, particularly DDT, on the environment, especially on birds and the water supply. And this helped lead to the Environmental Protection Agency, or the EPA. Now, this was created under Nixon's administration, and it was set up to help regulate businesses and their impact on the environment. We also have the Clean Air Act of 1970, which allowed the EPA to regulate air emissions by companies, so regulated how much pollution companies were putting into the air. And we have nuclear power as well. This was originally seen as an alternate to other energy forms, but there is some concern about the safety of nuclear plants by environmentalists, especially after 100,000 people were forced to flee their homes near the 3 Mile Island nuclear power plant. Go back to the economy of the 1970s. The Vietnam War, which really increased drastically under LBJ's administration, plus the Great Society, which I teach as basically the New Deal plus civil rights, adds to a large deficit and inflation in the 1970s. So the U.S. began to transform also from a manufacturing economy to a service economy. So instead of producing a lot of goods, we see industries that are developed around services as opposed to production. And again, stagflation, that is the theme of the 1970s economy. In 1971, Nixon removed the United States from the gold standard. Who advocated? Let's go back to a prior chapter. This one is like 19 or 20, I think. Who advocated changing the gold standard in the late 19th century? It was a 3-time presidential election loser. Not Henry Clay. I know what you're thinking. It's not Henry Clay. It was William Jennings Bryan. Remember his Cross of Gold speech? Definitely know that. That could be a great excerpt as well for a multiple choice question. So we have deindustrialization, that is when the country is producing less, and steel production fell drastically, and foreign steel was cheaper than American-made steel. We have the Rust Belt, and that is the area in the Northeast that saw a decline in industrial production. And this picture here is Lackawanna Steel, located not too far from where I live in Buffalo, about 20 minutes away. It was this huge plant that has since shut down, and lots of people in the Buffalo area lost their jobs who were working for Lackawanna Steel. So what's another famous belt we talked about in a previous chapter? down south. Come on, you know it. Yeah, that's right. It's the Sun Belt, and that is specifically mentioned in the new curriculum. So make sure you know the Sun Belt. So organized labor is also in decline during this time period because of many industrial jobs that were lost. This hurt the labor movement. And unions begin to focus on saving jobs as opposed to gaining higher wages as their number one goal. All right, so we have an increase in suburbs, left less revenue for cities. There's less of a tax base, which left many cities grappling to pay their bills. New York City in 1975 almost declared bankruptcy. So what is the impact of the growth of suburbs? Well, we have the growth of shopping centers, and businesses, in addition to people, began to move to suburbs. We have a tax revolt, which was popular in California, and this was a major component and victory, according to which is stated in the new curriculum, of the conservative movement. So the conservatives of the 1970s and especially the 1980s are really going to focus on tax reform. Absolutely, positively know that. We have Proposition 13 in California, which helped change taxes. They capped property taxes, and they increased the requirements to institute new tax measures to be 2/3 approved in the legislature. So in other words, in order to increase a tax, 2/3 of the legislature had to approve it as opposed to a simple majority. Now, this is an example of a referendum, Proposition 13, in which Californians voted for this. What famous progressive, going back to another chapter as well, let's make some connections here. What famous progressive was associated with the referendum? He's from Wisconsin. Looks like Joe Pesci from Home Alone, the guy who dressed up as a cop, the bad guy. There he is. Robert LaFollette. Look at him. It's Joe Pesci. You can't tell me it's not. And then what are some labor trends beginning in the 1970s? We have a large number of low-wage earners, a small group of high-wage earners at the top, and a decreasing number in the middle. So essentially we see the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer, and the middle is decreasing as well. All right, let's talk about Watergate. On June 17th, 1972, there is a break-in at the Democratic National Headquarters at the Watergate complex right down here. And the architects of the plan worked for Nixon's committee to re-elect the president, called CREEP. What a great acronym that is, CREEP. That's not weird at all. And Nixon helped obstruct the investigation. He ordered the CIA to tell the FBI to stop the investigation. Now, two journalists, Woodward and Bernstein, they helped blow the top off of the scandal. Their investigative journalism really opened this up. And on August 9th, 1974, Nixon becomes the first president in U.S. history to resign. Now, it's important to know he was not impeached. It was recommended that he be impeached. He would have been impeached if he didn't resign, but he was not impeached. Really quick, what does impeach mean? It does not mean to remove from office. It means to have charges brought against you. You could be removed from office, but that's not what impeached means. So Gerald Ford, who was his vice president, becomes president, and within a month, he grants Nixon a pardon, and here he is testifying before the House of Representatives, a committee, about why he granted that pardon. And this infuriated many Americans. They felt like there was a corrupt bargain. No, not the 1824 corrupt bargain with my boy Henry Clay, but they thought there was a new one. This helped to lead to more distrust of the federal government. So in the 1970s, the economic theme is stagflation, and really the political theme, you could say, is distrust of government because of the Vietnam War, because of scandals like Nixon's pardon and other ones that we'll talk about. So we see limiting a push to limit the power of the president. The War Powers Act was passed in 1973 over Nixon's veto, and this limited the ability of the president to send troops into combat. And what I want you to do is contrast this with the Gulf of Tonkin resolution of only 9 years earlier in 1964, which basically gave the president unlimited power in Vietnam. Now, Congress is trying to rein in some of the power of the president. The Freedom of Information Act was passed, in which citizens, and this is especially used by journalists, you'll see this on the news a lot, they can file to try to gain access to federal records. All right, Watergate babies. Many new Democrats benefited in the 1974 midterm election from Ford's pardon of Nixon. Many more Democrats were elected for the first time to Congress. And these elected officials helped reform politics and bring greater transparency to the government. They eliminated HUAC, that committee that investigated communism in the 1940s and 50s. They created the Ethics in Government Act, which required politicians to disclose financial contributions. And we see a political realignment as well. 1970s conservatives, I talked about this earlier, they focused on tax cuts and deregulation of industries to stimulate the economy. They argue that there's too much government involvement in industry, so one solution they proposed was to deregulate it. And deindustrialization led to population growth in the Sun Belt. And really, here is the Sun Belt. What we see here is these states increased drastically in population. So states such as New York, where I live, lost an incredible amount of political influence. The number of electoral votes is almost cut in half. Whereas California and Texas, they begin to gain an insane amount of electoral votes because that's where the population is going. All right, Jimmy Carter, he campaigns as being a Washington outsider. He was the governor of California and also a peanut farmer, in case you ever wanted to know that. And what is a Washington outsider? Well, it's somebody who is not associated with scandals and politics of D.C. He basically campaigned and said, listen, I'm not associated with this mess in Washington. You can trust me. And much of the Carter administration, again, 1970s he's elected, was plagued by stagflation. Let's jump on over to affirmative action. This has roots. This sought to combat racial discrimination by taking into account minority groups, and this was really advocated by JFK and the LBJ administration, so this had been around for a while. They favored encouraging government contractors to recruit racial minorities for jobs. This eventually, the idea of affirmative action, goes before the Supreme Court in Bach versus the University of California. Bach was a white student who applied at UC Davis Medical School, and he was denied. And what the Supreme Court ruled was they upheld the idea of affirmative action, of taking into consideration race as a factor for jobs or admissions to schools. But the Supreme Court rejected a quota system for minorities. In other words, a job cannot set aside 16 or 20 jobs reserved specifically for minorities. That, the Supreme Court said, is not okay, but taking into account somebody's race when making a decision is okay. All right, so let's jump on over to the women's movement and gay rights, women's activism. Women's groups made significant gains in the 1970s. Universities such as Yale became co-ed. They were no longer just a male school. New clinics and rape centers were established around the United States to help bring more awareness. The Equal Rights Amendment, very important idea. This was first introduced by Alice Paul in 1923. And it's not until 1972 that it passes both houses of Congress. And it looked like it was going to be approved by many states. And then this woman, Phyllis Schlafly, she comes along and she is opposed to the ERA. So she sought to stop the ERA in this campaign of Stop ERA. Now, she advocated traditional roles for women, and she feared that the amendment would change American society by leading to unisex bathrooms and even women being drafted into the military. So she argued that women already had certain special privileges that could be revoked with the Equal Rights Amendment. Ultimately, it was never ratified. It falls 3 states short. 36 of the 39 states required to ratify it do, but 3 states don't. And here is in red the states that ended up ratifying it. So Roe versus Wade, a very important court case from 1973. Going back throughout the 1960s, abortion was illegal in virtually every state in the country. And in Griswold versus Connecticut, a 1960s court case, the Supreme Court struck down a law forbidding contraceptives. And this is where this idea of right to privacy is established. The Supreme Court says that individuals, particularly families, have a right to privacy. So this right to privacy doctrine is established in Griswold versus Connecticut. And then in Roe v. Wade, the Supreme Court struck down a Texas law and declared abortion legal as long as it's within the first trimester, the first 3 months of a pregnancy. And the Supreme Court referenced that right to privacy doctrine established in Griswold versus Connecticut. Now here's kind of, since Roe v. Wade, how a graph depicting how Americans feel about Roe versus Wade. So you see that it is pretty polarizing in this country. And debates over the decision still exist today, 42 years later. All right, Harvey Milk, jumping over to San Francisco. He was an openly gay candidate, and he won a city council seat in 1977 in San Francisco. He became a very powerful symbol for the gay rights movement. And sadly, in 1978, he and the mayor of San Francisco were assassinated. So we had the Warren Court that we were talking about from beginning in 1954. The new Chief Justice is Chief Justice Warren Burger. So Nixon appoints him and 3 other justices to the Supreme Court, and he hopes to see a more conservative Supreme Court. And that is not necessarily what happened. In many ways, the Burger Court upheld ideas and precedents of the Warren Court. An example is the Roe versus Wade decision, which happened under the Burger Court, which the Supreme Court again referenced the idea of right to privacy and allowing abortion to be legal. Now, we see in the 1970s a sexual revolution happening in the country, and there are really three factors that increase discussions about sex. We have the birth control of the 1960s, counterculture or hippies of the baby boom generation, and also an increased feminine influence. And women's rights during this time, they really focused on a revolution in sexual values, not just behavior. So they wanted to challenge more of values, not necessarily behavior. So sex and pop culture, books, movies, and TV shows increasingly focused on sex in the 1970s. And for middle-class marriage, a new therapy industry emerged that really focused on counseling married couples and trying to decrease the divorce rate. And this industry was really made up of churches and secular groups as well. So jumping over to another great awakening we have in the 1970s and really throughout the 1980s, let's do a quick review. What was the impact of the second great awakening in antebellum America? That's right. They inspired reform movements such as abolition, women's rights, and temperance. Very good. I'm glad you remember that. So we have evangelical resurgence. Evangelical churches focused on members being born again and strictly interpreting the Bible. And this really goes back to, during this time, Billy Graham in the 1940s and the 1950s, who would travel the country giving sermons and converting many individuals. So what led to the revival in the 1970s? Well, like anything, any sort of awakening, we have kind of a decrease of the importance of church. So we also have that. So we have rising divorce rates, social unrest, and perceived moral decay. So we have a focus on religion and the family. Evangelicals focused on the nuclear family, this idea of a husband and wife and children, and the idea of the father as the breadwinner and the mother as a supporter. And evangelicals were also alarmed with sex education, abortion, and higher divorce rates. In particular, abortion and divorce rates are what they're going to focus on in the 1980s. All right, let's do a quick recap. OPEC and the oil crisis of 1973, know that. Rachel Carson and Silent Spring, holy cow, know that, and that it influenced the EPA. Stagflation is a really bad combination for the economy. Deindustrialization leads to a loss of many jobs in the United States. Watergate, Nixon's resignation, Ford's pardon of Nixon. How did the public perceive all that? Jimmy Carter as a Washington outsider. Bach versus the University of California upheld the idea of affirmative action, but got rid of the quota system. Equal Rights Amendment and Phyllis Schlafly, why she opposed it. Roe versus Wade legalized abortion and led to increased controversy. Harvey Milk was an openly gay politician from San Francisco, and reasons for the rise of evangelicalism in the 1970s and 1980s. All right, guys, thank you very much for watching. I look forward to seeing you back here for the second last chapter of the textbook. If you found this video helpful, please share this with other people. If you haven't already, please subscribe. I'm going to have lots of videos still coming before the exam in May. Please check out the description for other beneficial review videos, especially end of the year ones I've come up with that match with the new curriculum. And most importantly, best of luck to you in May. I appreciate you watching. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them in the section below, and have a good day.